Causality and tool use. Background. In the early 1960s, a former secretary who was working primarily alone in the African jungle made a scientific discovery that has continued to inspire research in the decades since. Jane Goodall observed that chimpanzees in Gombe National Park would modify sticks by removing leaves and then insert the sticks into termite mounds. As the termites grabbed onto the stick, presumably to attack the intruding object, the chimpanzees would remove the stick and quickly slide the termites into their mouths. At the time, tool use was assumed by many to be the domain of humans, a behavior that was unique to our species. But after this discovery, a flood of research documenting different types of tool use by wild chimpanzees was published. As researchers continue to document wild tool-using behavior across a wide range of species, including primates, birds, and marine mammals, a question remains regarding the cognitive processes that underlie the behavior. For example, tool use could be the result of many processes, including a predisposition to engage with certain objects using defined action patterns, predispositions coupled with operant conditioning, or a combination of predispositions, operant conditioning, and a system of learning by observing others. Inquiring even deeper, a second question remains as to whether a tool-using species is able to represent the causal relationships between the tool and the environment. Among other things, such an understanding might provide insight to solve additional problems that have an analogous causal structure. Chapter Plan. This chapter begins by considering causality from a historical and modern perspective. Many animals are sensitive to the consequences of their actions. Rats, for example, can learn to press levers for food, yet can they reason about their actions, understanding that the actions cause certain events to occur, e.g. the appearance of food? Then, the focus will shift to the causal nature of objects, including how they move and the properties that allow tools to help users achieve goals. Here, researchers address the topic of causal understanding by asking what, if anything, animals understand about the outcome of object interactions or why a tool can bring about a desirable outcome. Note that this chapter focuses on causality in the physical domain, but causality will be considered again in Chapter 10 in studies that examine whether animals recognize that mental states, e.g. beliefs, desires, can cause behavior. Causality. It is difficult to imagine life without the ability to represent causality. Without causal reasoning, one might think of a light switch as simply something that co-varies with the onset of light, not as a causal prerequisite for the onset. It would be difficult to realize, thus, that one could control the onset of the light by intentionally engaging with the switch. Without causal representations, a billiard game would simply appear to be a series of sequential ball movements, not instances of motion caused by contact. Research and theory in psychology and philosophy has a rich history on the topic of causality, investigating everything from the question of its very existence to examining how causal knowledge is achieved. For the latter, comparative study has led to advances in our understanding of the extents and limits of causal representations in animals, as well as our understanding of human causal cognition. This section begins with early philosophical and experimental considerations of causality. Then, two frameworks detailing the nature of causal understanding in animals will be presented. In much of this work, comparisons are made between animals and humans, though the animal species examined have broad phylogenetic range. The work is based in the laboratory, a requirement because in many cases, experience and environment must be as controlled as possible. It will be seen in later sections, however, that questions of causal understanding also pertain to research in the wild, in which naturally occurring tool use may be observed. The illusion of causality. The philosopher Hume famously argued that causality is an illusion. We cannot observe causality, but we nevertheless hold causal beliefs about connections among things. Even in simple physical interactions, such as the collision of billiard balls, he argued, causal inferences are unfounded. Motion in the second billiard ball is a quite distinct event from motion in the first, nor is there anything in the one to suggest the smallest hint of the other. That is, the events themselves do not present causality. The visual input is simply of coincident motion. Others, like Kant and ch8, propose that causal relations do have a special form, or spatio-temporal pattern, that is detected. Contact and launching events, like those of the billiard balls, have a certain motion pattern that yields the perception of causality. One does not simply perceive one ball stopping and another ball starting. One perceives causality because the brain automatically creates a causal impression. This perception is an illusion, ch8 still admitted, but it is a perception of a causal interaction. Further, this perception is relatively unaffected by higher-level beliefs, e.g., knowledge that the balls are actually just computer-animated circles with no mass does not change the perception. Since ch8's seminal work, many psychologists have examined the objective properties of actions that lead to the perception of causality, as well as the development of causal perception in young human infants. Leslie and Keeble, 1987, for example, showed 6-month-old infants a video of a red brick that moved toward a green brick and stopped, at which point the green brick began to move. Figure 8.1. These movies were part of a looking time habituation procedure, and after infants habituated, i.e. decreased their looking at the event to a predetermined criterion, test movies were shown in which the original movies were simply played in reverse. Importantly, 2 groups of infants were tested. One group saw habituation events in which the green brick moved immediately after being touched by the red brick, a launching event, and the other group saw the green brick move a short time after being touched, a delayed reaction event. Infants in the launching condition showed greater dishabituation, i.e. increased looking, to the reversed event in the test phase than infants in the delayed reaction condition, suggesting that the launching event was encoded as a causal interaction during habituation, and the change in roles during the test event warranted greater visual attention. Further, Leslie and Keeble proposed that causal perception may be an innate process of the visual system. Although some researchers have remained skeptical about the innate nature of causal perception, much work has documented its early development during human infancy. The perception of launching events has also been examined in animals, though little is known about the developmental processes. For adult pigeons, Young et al. 2006 found mixed results. The pigeons showed some indication of discrimination between launching events and gap events, in which the first object stopped prior to touching the second object, which nonetheless started to move. However, further analyses led the researchers to suggest that pigeons may attend to features of the events that human adults deem irrelevant, e.g., the duration of movement or the starting point of the launching object. In an intriguing follow-up experiment, Cabrera and colleagues found that pigeons visually tracked events in which an object appeared to approach and contact a food dispenser to a greater extent than they tracked movement away from the dispenser, a finding they humorously called the lunching effect. Figure 8.1. Launching and delayed reaction events as seen in Leslie and Keeble, 1987. In launching events, the first brick made contact with the second, which then immediately started to move. In contrast, delayed reaction events included a pause before the second brick began to move. Okay, so in direct launching, the white brick slowly moves toward the black brick, and then they touch, and then the black brick moves away from the white brick. In delayed reaction, we have the same first part where the white brick moves toward the black brick, and then they touch, but then there is a delay before the black brick begins to move off from the white brick. The causal perception of ch8's launching event has been more thoroughly studied in humans, but studies like those above suggest that animals may share similar perceptions. It is possible, though, that the nature and familiarity of the stimuli, e.g. video versus real world, and the ecological validity, e.g. in relation to food, etc., may influence experimental results. Physical causal events such as launching, however, are only one form of causality. Premack 1995, for example, contrasts the natural causality of launching with arbitrary causality, in which the generative processes of the causal interaction are not as apparent, e.g., pecking a key causes food to appear. Indeed, even ch8 1963 suggested that the psychological mechanisms that underlie these two types of causal representation might differ. In the remainder of this section, the comparative research on arbitrary causality will be presented, focusing on how such representations might be formed and which species might form them. Association and causality. As noted in Chapter 4, operant conditioning is a change in behavior based on the consequences of that behavior. This may occur because organisms learn an association between stimuli in the environment and the response, e.g., a lever and a lever press, which is reinforced by the outcome, e.g., food. This stimulus response, SR learning, also called habit learning, contrasts with learning to associate a response and an outcome, e.g., lever press and food. Response outcome, RO, associations suggest that an animal connects what they did with what happened. A question then arises as to whether it is accurate to characterize this form of association as a causal representation. It is clear that some aspects of conditioning parallel aspects of causality. Dickinson and colleagues have proposed that humans and animals use associative mechanisms to learn about causal relations. Causal learning is thus a byproduct of associative learning by this account. The associative strength is considered functionally as causal strength. Under this framework, associationist theory can explain how information regarding causality is acquired. However, it is not easy to explain all experimental findings with associative models. For example, Deniston et al. 2003 presented rats with trials in which two stimuli, e.g. tones and lights, could occur with the availability of water, denoted here as AX plus, e.g. A equals tone, X equals light, plus equals water. Then, XY plus trials occurred in which the A stimulus was replaced with Y. Subsequently, some of the rats were presented with A in the absence of the water, A minus, and these rats responded less strongly to later presentations of Y than rats who did not receive A minus trials. Importantly, this change in response to Y occurred even though A and Y were never presented together. Some researchers have proposed that findings such as these support the idea that rats are engaging in higher-order reasoning about causality. That is, through the A- extinction trials, rats learned that A was not the cause and inferred that X, thus, must be the cause of water presentation. By extension, Y was also inferred to be non-causal. This inferential account is appealing because existing associative models cannot account for the change in behavior to Y. However, the authors of the original study have created an account of their findings that is based on an associative foundation, though it extends well beyond traditional accounts. Their revised model does not assume the type of inference proposed by de Hauer and colleagues. In sum, it is becoming apparent that some conditioning tasks may actually imply causal learning that cannot be explained through associations unless the associative model is modified from traditional forms. As this debate continues, alternative proposals for the creation of causal representations have been proposed. These accounts, described in the next section, generally propose that animals and humans infer the causal structure of events and that causal learning strays from the tenets of associative theory. Inferring causal structure. The study of human causal reasoning has been influenced greatly by the proposal that people understand causal structures in the world in a manner that can be modeled by causal Bayes nets. Causal Bayes net theory entails mathematical algorithms that go beyond the scope of this book, but much can be explained in basic terms. With causal Bayes nets, Causal structures of the world are depicted with graphs such as those found in Figure 8.2, in which the letters denote events and the arrows denote causal relationships. In the common cause model, for example, an event A can result in B and can also result in C, but B and C do not have a causal relationship. Causal chain models, in contrast, represent instances in which event A causes B, which in turn causes C. Figure 8.2, two causal structures. In the common cause model, A can result in B and result in C, though B and C are not related causally. In the causal chain model, A causes B, which causes C. Okay, so it's like boxes with arrows between them. So in the common cause model, you have an A box at the top and two arrows from the A box leading to box B and another arrow leading to box C. In the causal chain model, you have box A with an arrow leading to box B and then an arrow from box B leading to box C. There have been different approaches to the question of how an individual might infer one of these causal structures from input from the environment. One might experience events in the environment that co-vary, yet this information must be translated into a representation of the causal relationships. After all, as courses in statistics remind us, correlation does not imply causation. According to some researchers, causal structure can be learned by attending to covariation and the conditional probabilities of events. Other approaches additionally posit that pre-existing assumptions like causes precede effects help to constrain learning about causal structures, or that prior knowledge in a particular domain can affect causal inference. Over the past 2 decades, causal Bayes nets have greatly influenced the study of human causal cognition, including its early development. Box 8.1, Box 8.1, Cognitive Development and Causality, Detecting Blickets. Some researchers have proposed that even early in development, humans observe correlations and engage in further cognitive processes that lead to the creation of causal representations of events in the world. For example, if event Y causes event Z, then the occurrence of Y makes the occurrence of Z all the more likely. Observing and encoding this correlation is a cue to the actual causal structure in the world. Of course, this is only one cue, and correlation alone is not sufficient. For example, if Z also occurs in the presence of X and Y together, then all three are correlated, but it is unclear whether one or both caused Z. However, conditional information such as observing that Z does not co-occur in the presence of X alone would indicate that Z is only an effect of Y. Thus, a system that can attend to covariation and conditional probability can start to learn about causal structures in the world. To examine whether young children engage in causal inference in this manner, researchers created a clever task involving a Blicket detector, a box that played music when a certain type of object, a Blicket, was placed on top of it. In a series of studies, 3- and 4-year-old children observed events in which objects, A and B, were placed on top of the box. For example, in one experiment, A was placed on the box alone and music played, but there was no music when B was subsequently used. Then, both A and B were used together twice and music played each time. Children correctly inferred that only A was a Blicket cause, even though B was involved in the music outcome more often than not. However, these findings might be best explained by blocking. After learning that A is associated with the onset of music, the association with B is not learned. In fact, some of the Blicket detector studies can be explained by either traditional associative learning models or, in the case of complex Blicket detector paradigms, more modern associative frameworks that were designed to account for laboratory animal studies that follow similar premises. That is, children may be solving these tasks based on the recognition of associative strength between certain objects and the box. However, Sobin et al. 2004 proposed that causal Bayes net theories more accurately explain the data. First, children appear to be making inferences after only a few trials, whereas even modern associative frameworks are based on many more opportunities for observation. Second, Sobel and colleagues found that children rely on Bayesian inference. They start by constraining the number of possible causal structures by considering prior probabilities, and then update to determine the most likely structure based on new observations. Thus, children appear to integrate statistical knowledge into the process of creating causal structure. It remains to be determined whether humans are alone in this ability. There is some evidence that rats can also understand causal relations in a manner consistent with causal Bayes net theories.